In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Fantasy Grounds Classic options, and we're going to be using the 5th edition rule set. The 5th edition rule set does inherit a series of options that are from the core RPG, and we'll be talking about each of those. We'll also be looking at a few of the options that are specific to the 5th edition rule set. To get to our options menu window, we'll come up here to the data buttons, click on options, and that will open up our options window. Very important here on the options window is this question mark up at the top right. This will open up in your browser the wiki page that has information specific to all of the options. So you can go ahead and read through all of the different things, what they mean, what their default values are. Now, before we jump into the individual options, I want to point out that options by default are composed of or organized into these 5 different categories. Client options, game options, combat token, and house rules. Of these, the players can only modify those that are in the client group. Everything else is restricted to only the GM. The GM will want to set these up before players begin connecting so that the games are always consistent for your players. So let's take a look first at client, the various client options. And again, these are things that the players will be able to modify and have it actually separate from the GM. So the first one is the Ring on Whisper. When we do Ring on Whisper, if somebody sends you a whisper here in the chat /WGM, or if you send it to a player, you can also whisper by right-clicking on their portrait up here and select whisper and type something in. It just makes a noise so that you are aware that somebody whispered to you. That's the entire option there. So next up is our dice manual entry. So by default, when we roll dice, it rolls and outputs here in the chat, and Fantasy Grounds will automatically generate some kind of a random number depending on the dice that we roll. There are times, however, when we want to be able to put the dice value or the dice result in ourselves. Perhaps you are playing at a table live with your players, and they are rolling with their physical dice, but you want to take advantage of the automation that Fantasy Grounds allows and offers. So by setting this to dice manual to on, a couple of things happen. First up, we're now going to have this rolls button appear at the top left of the chat. Click on the rolls button and it comes up with this manual dice entry window. It'll also pop up automatically whenever we attempt to make a roll. So if I roll anything, this manual dice entry window will pop up. Now when this does, it gives me the option to select information about each dice roll. First off, I can type in the value, and then I select one of these 4 buttons. The X just cancels the roll. This dice looking symbol just says ignore whatever we've typed in and allow Fantasy Grounds to randomly generate a number, as if you did not have that option turned on. This F button says fake the roll, but accept the value that that we typed in here, no matter what the displayed roll result is. So if I click on the F button, the fake roll, you can see it said 12, but I output a 14. So it'll do whatever I had manually typed in. And then this last one is the checkbox. If I type in 14 again, it just means that don't even bother rolling the fake dice. Don't even bother doing that animation. Just go ahead and accept the roll as if it were a 14, and you can see it automatically accepts it. For a DM, the player does not know whether or not the roll was manually entered or not. But if a player turns that on, there will be a notification on that roll that indicates that that roll was manually entered. So your players can't cheat or anything without the DM being aware of it. So next up is the targeting, and it's default set to multi and set to remove on miss. Now what this means is that when you are using the combat tracker and you are targeting creatures with things like a spell, and half made their saving throw and half failed their saving throw. What this will do is this will automatically remove all of the creatures that succeeded on their saving throw from the list of character or entries who are going to be affected by the damage of that spell. So if I'm targeting 5 creatures and 2 of them made their saving throw, it will automatically drop them, but it'll keep me targeting the remaining 3 so that when I roll my damage roll, they will take the appropriate amount of damage. Now you do have a few other options. You can turn that off or just remove on miss on. Multi tends to be the most useful, so I probably want to leave it on that. Next up is the turn auto center on map. When you have a map, for example, a combat map like this, and we have some creatures or players on our map, as we cycle through initiative, let me shrink the map down so that it's focused entirely on one token. As we progress through initiative, it will shift the map to focus itself on the individual token that has, or NPC that has initiative. And that's what this entry does. If we turn that off, then it will no longer switch between. Now, as a DM, I find it useful to have on because you can be frequently searching for which NPC am I supposed to be processing, which one, whose turn is it. Whereas for the player, most of the time they tend to be focusing on their particular character's location and the map immediately surrounding themselves. So players may want this one off, while DMs, in my experience, typically want it on. And that's all that's available for our clients, for players to be able to change. Now let's take a look at the rest of them that are limited to the GM. So first up is set GM voice to active combat tracker. Now what this means is here on the chat, when we type in anything, it appears as if the GM said it. However, if we set this to on, when an NPC gains initiative, you'll see that now it says noble. If I type in something, it appears as if the noble said it. But as soon as I pass initiative, that goes away. So whichever NPC has the active character in initiative, whichever NPC has initiative, that will now allow the GM to speak with that voice. All right, next up is show all whispers to the GM. This just is the GM going to see whispers that players make to one another. If you want to be able to see what players are saying to one another, you can turn that on, and you'll have visibility to what they're saying. Next up is the show GM roles. So by default, show GM roles is off, and when you make a roll here in the chat window, you can see that there's this eyeball symbol with a slash through it here on the left. That indicates that that roll is not visible to the players. They won't be able to see the results of that roll. By changing it to on, now that eyeball symbol is no longer there, and that means that the players will be able to see the results of that roll. So we're actually going to come back to this one in just a moment because there's a corresponding option that we'll talk about in just a second. Actually, we'll go ahead and cover that right now. The other one that is related to the show GM roles is this dice tower. Now the dice tower, if I have show GM roles to off and I turn the dice tower on the DM side, I won't see anything. On the player's client, I will. This will turn the dice tower on for the players, but it doesn't turn it on for the GM. Now the dice tower is a way of rolling the dice so that only the GM can see it. If you want the GM to have the option of the dice tower as well, then both this option, the table dice tower, and the show GM rolls have to be turned on. When both are turned on, the dice tower will appear, and any rolls can be made directly into the dice tower to keep them hidden from the players, or into the chat to make them visible to the players. So you have the choice on any given roll. Next up is show results to client. Do you want your players to see the results of the roll? or do you want to keep them hidden? So, you know, you can roll it or you can turn it off. And for friendly, that means that they'll only be able to see rolls that of other players in their party. And off means they just won't be able to see the results of any roll. Default is to leave it on. Next up is show roll totals. This means that when we make a roll, normally Fantasy Grounds will automatically sum up the values of the individual die. If you have that off, it will go ahead and roll and just provide you with the die themselves, not the total of them. This next option is the decal image. That's this image that appears behind here. This is the default SmiteWorks one. I do have a decal extension loaded, so I can click here to toggle through. I've got some of the player's handbook decal loaded, so it gives me the option of loading up the player's handbook decal, having that visible in the background, or you can turn it off. Next up is the show characters to clients. So this affects the party sheet. Here on the party sheet, you'll have one or more characters listed here. These are the active players who will be participating in your game. With show characters to clients as off, the players will not have visibility to the main tab of the party sheet. You can see here on the main tab it has an overview, and they will not be able to see that overview. So information about the race or hit dice or hit points or stats, abilities, anything like that. They will not be able to see that. The DM will always have visibility. This is controlling what players can see about other characters. Next up is the party show inventory to clients. This controls whether or not players are able to see what is in the inventory of another player. So by default here on the party sheet, the players will see just these top two windows, the list of parcel items and the list of coins that are currently in the parcel. Now we add those just by dragging and dropping a parcel onto there, and it adds the appropriate entries. But players do not see the bottom two, the party coins, which is all of the coins currently held by all members on the party sheet. And the party inventory is all items currently held by all members in the party sheet. So right now you can see the party contains no coins, and the inventory contains chainmail and a mace. If I distribute my items, then these will now become party coins. And if I had multiple players, I could see exactly how many were held by each player. So if you want your players want to keep their inventories secret from one another, you need to keep this option off. Otherwise, you can turn it on and they'll be able to see who is carrying what. You know, you've got 3 potions of healing, you can give me one, or you've got 500 gold, you can give me a couple for something. That sort of thing. All right, moving on to the combat related options. First up, we have our initiative. So the default for 5th edition is that initiative is done as a group, meaning that if you have multiple creatures of the same type, they will all be given the same initiative. So right here we have it set to group, and I am going to add 5 Aarakocra to my combat tracker. When I do that, it will automatically assign each of them the same initiative. But that's handy for in-person games, because it can be mentally taxing for the DM to keep track of everything. But here in Fantasy Grounds, we don't have to. The Fantasy Grounds will keep track of everybody's initiative for us. So your other options are to turn it off, which means when they're added, it won't roll initiative at all. Or to set it on, it'll just automatically roll the initiative. And that's what we want. So on means each individual token or each individual NPC will have its own unique initiative rolled. Now, players, of course, we make them roll their own initiative because it's their character, but each NPC can have a completely different initiative. Next up is our NPC numbering. You can see when we add them to the combat tracker, it has appended a number value. Since we have 5 Aarakocra, they all look the same. They are now labeled as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If we change that, we can set it to like random, And then when we add them, we have 1, 5, 8, 3, 4, different values. So you can't tell how many total there were. You can also set it to off so that they now all just appear as Aarakocra. They don't have any numbering. That makes it harder to tell which one you're supposed to be aiming for, though. Next up is NPC roles, variable or fixed. The default is variable. So let's take a look at what that means here on an NPC record. Here on an NPC record, if we take a look at it, we can see that for hit points, there is a default value, and then there is a dice string for a randomly generated value. Attacks also will have a default damage and a dice string to roll. So when this NPC rolls, variable or fixed, is set to variable, it will use the dice string. So they will each have a unique different set of hit points, differently rolled hit points. They will each roll damage differently. If you set it to fixed, it will use the stated value. So if you want more variability, more randomness, you can set it to variable. If you want things to be the same every time for consistency, you can set it to fixed. This next one, player ring bell on turn, for a DM is one of the very handy options that are available. When a player's character receives the initiative, then Fantasy Grounds will make a noise on that player's PC to remind them, hey, it's your turn in initiative. Put down your phone, wake up, and pay attention. And so that will cycle through. And it only does it for players. It doesn't do it to the DM who has 10 NPCs. Next up is player show turn order. So this determines what players can see when you have multiple creatures in initiative. So if I go ahead and add everybody to initiative here, and I have show turn order to on, the players will be able to see everybody and when they're going. If I have show turn order to friendly, they will see the turn order only for the players, everybody here in green, but they will not see what initiative values or what order the NPCs will go in. If you don't like players to have too much of a metagaming, knowing, oh, it's going to be 3 turns before this NPC, you can turn that to friendly, and then they won't be able to tell when the NPC might go next, it might go last. You don't know. And turning show turn order to off means they will not see the NPC or the turn order for anybody, both friendly and NPCs. They won't know who's next until their turn comes up, and that's all they'll be able to know is when it's their turn. Here on show effects, this allows us, if you have a creature that has an effect. For example, let's give Aarakocra 2. We'll add him an effect. When I process through initiative, normally nothing particularly special happens here on the chat, but if I turn show effects to on, then when Aarakocra 2 again gains initiative, it outputs all of the effects that are applying to that NPC. So it's just a way of showing the effects here in the chat, whether you want that displayed or not. Turn skip hidden actor allows us to skip over creatures that are marked as hidden in the combat tracker. So for example, if we have all of these creatures here and we want to add them to a map, let's say we have our map here, we add some creatures, and let's make several of them visible. So we've got 3 that are visible and 2 that are still hidden from the players. Now with skip hidden actors to off, every time I advance initiative, it will go to the next person in turn. If I have it to on, then it will skip any that are hidden. So it will go to Aarakocra 2 because he's visible, 5 because he's visible, 1 because he's visible. But when I go to the next actor again, it's going to skip over 3 and 4 and immediately proceed to test care because those are both marked as hidden. They're not visible here on the map. This is useful if you want to, you don't want your players to realize there are additional NPCs on the combat tracker that they can't see on the map. Say, hey, there's somebody got the initiative, but we don't see anybody on the map, so there's somebody hiding around here. If you want to avoid that kind of metagaming, you can set that skip hidden actor to on. Next up is stop at round start. So as we proceed through initiative, normally when you get to the last one, it just jumps up to the very first one again next. If you have it set to on, then as you proceed through, it stops. Nobody has initiative, and then you have to click it one more time. This allows you to pause in between total initiative rounds, and then restart the on the next round. All right, so this bar colors, view bar colors, refers to the various health bars that are available. And we'll show the different health bars here in a second, but you can see if I zoom in close here on this NPC, there is a green kind of a button down here in the bottom right, or a green image. Now, this will reflect the current health of that NPC. Players will have it as well. And you can do the standard colors, or you can do a tiered color. And it just is changing the number of colors that are visible. So in standard mode, it goes from green to yellow to red. And in tiered mode, it has a few more levels. It goes from green to light green to yellow to orange and then to red. So it's 6 different stages versus 4 different stages. Here on View Ally, next up is we have the options of detailed and status and off. So this means what the players will see about their allies. So do they see, if it's set to detailed, they will see the exact number of hit points that each other will have, currently has. So they'll be able to see, you know, you're down 5 hit points, you're at 32 hit points, or whatever the specific number is. If it's set to status, they will only be able to see a generic, healthy, wounded, you know, critical status message as opposed to the actual numbers. So you can choose what players can see about each other. And if it's set to off, they can't see anything. They have no idea whether the person is full health or 1 hit point from death. Detailed just means that you have more layers, similar to how tiered is. You have more layers of wounds being demonstrated. So you know your standard is light, moderate, heavy, and critical. Or detailed shows additional light, moderate, heavy, critical, whereas standard just shows a more limited set. Same thing with health non-ally. This is what players can see about NPCs. Default is set to status, so they just get an indication of, yeah, they're lightly wounded, they're heavily wounded, they're moderately wounded. If you set it to off, they can't see anything. And detailed, again, they will be able to see the actual hit points for the NPCs. Next up is the wound categories. So when you have the status set, you can have it set to either a simple wound categories or detailed wound categories. When you're simple, it's just going to be healthy, wounded, heavy, and dying. And the detailed is going to be healthy, light, moderate, heavy, critical, and dying. So it's the different categories that are visible when you have status set up. All right, let's take a look next at the tokens. The tokens refer to how things will generally appear here on the map. So let me zoom out here on the map and let's take a look at these. First off is the auto scale to grid. Now, if you have a battle map, it's of course always useful to have a grid pre-drawn on. So let's go ahead and re-add my Aarakocra, but I don't have them added to the map just yet. So by default, auto scale to grid is set to 80% of a grid size. So if I add a particular creature, you can see that the token has been scaled down to fill up approximately 80% of the square. If I set this to 100 and I add a token, you can see it's been scaled to fill all the way up to the full size of the square that the creature is in. If I set it to off, then it's going to scale it entirely based on its resolution compared with the map's resolution. So if you had a really large image file for your token and a very low resolution map, you may end up getting really crazy sized stuff. But generally you want it to auto scale so that creatures will appear the correct size when they're added. Next up, we have a variety of different effect icon sizes. So when we have effects applied to an NPC, for example, if we add this one and I say AC4, I've added an effect to this creature, and there's these icons that appear. Now, there's a variety of different icons that might appear depending on the various effects or statuses that are associated with it. And this allows you to change from small, large, or the standard size. Next up is our facing indicator. Now in 5th edition, facing is not a standard part of the rules, so it's default setting to off. If you do want to use the facing indicator, you can turn it to on, and then each token will now have this little yellow arrow pointing the direction that it's facing. You can use your mouse wheel to modify the direction that that particular token is facing if you use the facing rules. By default, though, it is off. Next up, these next two are going to affect how the interface displays to the GM, how the window looks to the GM. So here on the GM, the show effects, we can choose to either, the default is icons, which is this particular icon right here, or we can switch to icons hover. That means that it normally doesn't display anything, but if I hover my mouse over, then that icon will be displayed. You can also select mark, and that just indicates, hey, there is a mark there, or a mark hover, same thing, and I can turn it off. So those are the variety of options. You'll notice the icons and the mark are slightly different. The icons are more specific to the actual effect, whereas mark is generic. Next up is health, and that's how do we want our health to display. The default, as you can see here, is a dot to indicate the NPC's health or the player's health. We can cycle through, same thing with dot hover, so the dot will only appear when we mouse over a particular token. Or we can set it to off, or you can set it to a bar, which shows an entire bar. So as a creature takes damage, let's take a look at Arakaka 4. As the creature gets more and more damaged, you can see the bar goes down. Bar hover is the same thing, where it will only display when you're mousing over it. So those are the different options that you have available to you. Now we have the same kinds of options available for players. So for players, what do they see about allies? This is, do they see their allies' various effects, either as an icon or a mark, or off? Do players see their allies' health, either as a dot or a bar or whatever? And then what do players see about enemy effects? Do they see anything? Do they have any indication of effects that are on the NPCs? Or are they limited? And what do players see about the enemy health? Again, is it a dot? Is it a bar? The colors that you notice used on the bar, I do want to mention again, that is set here by the view bar colors, whether it's tiered or standard, which colors are going to be used to cycle through the bar. And then last up is the NPC's name. Does it show as a tooltip? Now a tooltip means when I mouse over it, you can see it's got this little tooltip that appears with the name. If I select title, then it'll be always on, and it also includes the numbering. You can see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Title hover, just mouses it over it, or off. That's token again. And then lastly, let's go over the various house rules. These are optional, of course, with 5th edition. First up is the attack, fumble, critical tables. These are defaulted to off. So by default, these do nothing. The fumble and crit tables are used when you want something special to happen on a critical hit, which is rolling a 20, or a critical fumble, which is rolling a 1. In order to use these, you have to make sure that you have an appropriate table created or loaded. So by default, Fantasy Grounds does come with, Fantasy Grounds does come with a default fumble and critical hit tables. If you purchase Rob Tui's, he has a set of tables as well. With that table loaded, it will appear here in the default. You can see them titled critical hit effect, fumble, and fumble effect. If you want to create your own tables, they just have to have these exact names. So with these tables loaded, you can choose whether to apply it to both fumble and crits, only fumbles, or only critical hits. And then when you roll a critical hit, it will automatically roll on the table and tell you what the additional effect that's going to be applied. Next up is our combat tracker auto death rolls. This is primarily used for players to automatically roll death saving throws. So with 5th edition, if you die, you have to make a death saving throw. If you hit 3 death saving throws, your character's permanently dead. There are certain conditions like taking damage while dead that can force to trigger a death saving throw. And those kinds of things. So this will automate that process. If you want to manually do it, you can turn that to off, and then players will have to do that themselves here by clicking on the death saves roll, and then it will automatically do that for them. Next up is our NPC hit points. So you'll notice here on the combat tracker, all of these Aarakocra have exactly 13 hit points. And that's because this value is set to standard. Now, we'll go back to the NPC sheet again. You can see here the hit points has a value of 13 as the standard, and variable is the dice string here, 3d8. So if I want to switch this to max, it'll mean this every one has 24. So if I add another one here, you'll see that it has 24 hit points. Or if I set it to random, it will randomly roll. So here we have one with 12 hit points. And so you can randomly generate the hit points that are available for your NPC. Similar to the fumble crit tables, there's the massive system shock. Oh, sorry, I skipped one. Roll initiative each round. Roll initiative in each round by default is off. Right? By default, every round, everybody goes in the same initiative order. If you have it to on, then when the last person finishes their turn, Fantasy Grounds will automatically re-roll initiative for everybody and resort them all. So everybody will now go in a different order. I do urge caution with this because Fantasy Grounds does not automatically adjust the duration of effects. So for example, if I cast a spell on an NPC that says this effect will end at the end of my next turn, Fantasy Grounds, when it reshuffles the initiative order, does not automatically adjust when that particular effect will end. And so it may go off on the wrong initiative order. So just be aware of that. You'll need to double check the effects and make sure that they're ending at the appropriate time. Next up is damage massive system shock. If you want to use those rules, you can just turn it on or off as applicable. This does some things. It's from the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's some optional rules for how damage is done. For map diagonal distance, now the default rule in 5th edition is that every square counts for 5 feet. Now I can count the movement of my squares by first locking the tokens here on the map. And then as the DM, I would use the middle mouse button to click and draw the movement. And you can see here it says 15 feet. Now, with 5th edition, if I move diagonally, the standard rule is that it's no different. 3 squares each one is 5 feet no matter what. If you prefer something that's a little bit more realistic and tries to actually use math, you can do the diagonal distance variant. Now what that means is that the first 5 feet of diagonal movement is going to cost 5. The second square of diagonal movement will cost 10 for a total of 15. So here are the variant. Now if I draw movement 5, 15. If I draw it vertically, it'll go 5, 10. It only applies to the diagonal movement 5, 15. All right. Next up is encumbrance. Do you use the standard rules or the variant rules? Those are defined in the Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide. Similarly with healing variants, the standard is what everybody's normally used to. You fully heal up on a long rest, and you spend hit dice on a short rest. If you can change it to some variants such as healing surges, where you healing is accelerated after with all your hit dice being recovered after a long rest, and a fourth of your hit dice recoveries after a short rest, but you don't automatically restore your hit points. So you don't regain hit points on a long rest, but you regain all your healing surges. And then natural healing, slow natural healing, no hit points are recovered at the end of a long rest. You have to take like a week or whatever it is the rules state in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Last up is the inspiration slots. On your character sheet, players can gain inspiration. By default, they get 1 point. If you want, you can have 2 or 3. If you like to play with more inspiration points than the default standard is. Next up here on the options, we have these bottom 2 buttons here, and that is languages and currencies. So let me close these other windows, get them out of the way. First up is our languages. Now, when you load the 5th edition rule set, it will come with all of the default 5th edition languages predefined for you. You'll have the name of the language, and you will have the script or font that's used when that language is used here in the chat. So for example, if I normally type something in, there's no language selection, it'll just fill it in normally. However, if I select one of these like Abyssal, and I type something in, it'll send it to the players using that font. Characters who understand Abyssal will receive the translation. Characters who do not understand Abyssal will not receive the translation, so they won't be able to tell what's being said. And the characters, the letters that are sent to characters who do not understand will be scrambled, so they won't even get this specific sequence of characters. So you can't learn the font. If your character doesn't know the language, there's no way you'll be able to translate it. Now we can add additional fonts or additional languages to Fantasy Grounds by clicking on the Edit List button and clicking Add Item. So this is useful for things like Thieves' Cant, or some of the older editions used to have things like Druidic as their own languages. Perhaps you have regional languages. So once you type in the name and hit the Tab button, it'll resort based on alphabetic sorting. Now Thieves' Cant is listed here, and I can drop down and select what font I want to use. Now there's only a few fonts by default. You can add additional fonts using extensions. There's a number of font extensions available on the Fantasy Grounds forums that are for free. So you can pick whichever font you want to use. Now once you've created that language entry, it'll now appear here on our speaking list. So I can click Thieves' Cant and I can type hello there here in Thieves' Cant. And only players who speak Thieves' Cant will understand it. In addition to languages, we can also define currencies. This is something relatively new with Fantasy Grounds, but it comes predefined all of the default currencies, the platinum, gold, electrum, silver, and copper. If you want to have additional ones, you can go ahead and just add additional currencies here, AD for astral diamonds or whatever you would like. Note that you also want to, when you have an item parcel, for example, this parcel right here, you can add additional currencies as well, simply by clicking on the edit list, add item, give it a number and a currency, 34 AD. Now, when I add this to a character sheet, for example, here's my test character, here in my inventory tab, you can see I've got the default currencies all set up. If I go ahead and add something, so he has one of everything, and I add this to him, it will create all of the different currency fields for me. If there's more currency types than these 6 fields, they'll appear on this line down here and keep track of them. So that's how you can add additional currencies to your game if you don't want to use the standard, or if you want to add some things in addition to the standard listing. In our next video, we'll be going over the various chat commands and what they do. Thank you.